1971, FBI Special Agent Frank Glimmer vanished from Washington, D.C. He was a rising star, a dedicated husband, and a father of two. One moment he was at the heart of the nation's top law enforcement agency, and the next, he was gone. No note, no witnesses, no ransom demand. The investigation into his disappearance quickly turned into one of the most baffling cases in the Bureau's history, a cold file gathering dust in a locked cabinet. For 7 long years, his family lived in a state of suspended grief, haunted by unanswered questions and the dark cloud of suspicion that he had abandoned his life, or worse, betrayed his country. The official story was a void. The truth was a tomb. For 7 years, the case remained a mystery, a ghost story whispered in the halls of the Hoover Building. Then, in 1978, a demolition crew, tasked with clearing a derelict apartment building, made a shocking discovery. What they found inside a padlocked room would not only solve the riddle of Frank Glimmer's disappearance, but would also unravel a conspiracy of power and murder that reached into the highest echelons of the federal government, changing everything everyone thought they knew about the man who simply vanished. Frank Glimmer was, by all accounts, a man carved from a block of pure conviction. He was not flashy, nor was he a maverick who bent the rules. He was something far more formidable, meticulously thorough, quietly brilliant, and possessed of an integrity so unyielding it was almost a physical force. His colleagues at the FBI respected him, even if they found his by-the-book approach occasionally frustrating. He believed in the system, in the clean lines of law and order, and saw his role not as a job but as a calling. He joined the Bureau to put away criminals, to protect the innocent, to be a small but sturdy cog in the great machine of justice. This wasn't just rhetoric for Frank. It was the foundational code of his existence. He saw the world in terms of right and wrong, and he had placed himself firmly on the side of right. Outside of his work, this intensity softened into a quiet, steadfast devotion to his family. His wife, Eleanor, was his anchor. They had met in college, her vibrant artistic spirit a perfect complement to his grounded, analytical mind. She understood the silences that came with his job, the long hours, the burdens he carried home but could never speak of. She was the keeper of their life's warmth, the one who ensured their small suburban home was a sanctuary from the often dark world Frank confronted daily. They had 2 children, a daughter, Sarah, who was 6, and a son, Michael, just 4 years old. To them, he was not Special Agent Glimmer. He was just Dad. He was the man who, despite his serious demeanor, would get down on the floor to build towering block castles, only to roar like a monster and knock them down to their delighted shrieks. He taught Sarah how to ride her bike on a sunny Saturday, running patiently behind her, his hand steady on the seat, until she finally pedaled away on her own, her triumphant laughter echoing down the street. He would read bedtime stories to Michael every night he was home, using different voices for each character, his deep baritone a comforting rumble in the quiet of the boy's room. These were the moments that defined him. His core ambition was clear and simple: to rise through the ranks of the FBI not for power, but for the ability to take on more significant cases, to make a bigger impact. He was on the cusp of a promotion, a move that would have brought more responsibility, but also more stability for his family. He and Eleanor had just put a down payment on a larger house in a neighborhood with better schools. They were planning a future, a life filled with scraped knees, family vacations, graduations, and all the ordinary, beautiful milestones that lay ahead. Frank had everything to live for. He had a wife who adored him, children who idolized him, a career he was passionate about, and a future that seemed as bright and orderly as the carefully organized files on his desk. The life that was about to be stolen from him was not just a collection of facts on a resume. It was a rich, textured world of love, purpose, and promise. It was the laughter in his home, the trust in his children's eyes, the shared dreams with his wife. When he vanished, he didn't just leave a physical void. He ripped a hole in the fabric of their universe, leaving behind a silence where a life used to be. The emotional stakes were immeasurable, because the life he was living was priceless. The last day of Frank Glimmer's known existence, October 12, 1971, began like any other. It was a crisp autumn Tuesday in Washington, D.C. He kissed Eleanor goodbye at the door, a routine so practiced it was muscle memory, and reminded Sarah to be careful on the school bus. He tousled Michael's hair before heading out, his black Ford sedan pulling away from the curb at precisely 7:15 a.m. But beneath the surface of this mundane morning, pressure was mounting. Frank was deep into a case that was far from routine. It was a sensitive internal investigation into potential corruption, a web of political blackmail that he was beginning to suspect involved figures far more powerful than he had initially imagined. The case files were kept under double lock in his office, and he spoke of it to no one, not even his closest colleagues. The day was a series of tense, closed-door meetings. He spent the morning reviewing surveillance logs and financial records that painted a disturbing picture. The trail was leading him closer and closer to a senior official within the Bureau itself, a man once considered a mentor to many, including Frank. This realization weighed on him. He believed in the institution, and the thought of such deep-seated betrayal was profoundly troubling. Around 2 p.m., a memo was hand-delivered to his desk by a junior agent. It was a summons to an unscheduled meeting with his direct superior, a man named Deputy Director Evans. The meeting was brief and strained. Evans seemed unusually agitated, questioning Frank's methods on the case and warning him about overreaching. Frank stood his ground, stating that he was following the evidence. He left the meeting with a knot in his stomach, the encounter feeling less like a word of caution and more like a veiled threat. At 4:30 p.m., he received a cryptic note delivered by an inter-office courier. It contained only a time and an address. 8 p.m., the Starlight Motel, room 112, Arlington. Come alone. It was unsigned, but Frank recognized the coded phrasing of an informant he had been cultivating, a low-level political aide who had promised to provide damning evidence. This was the break he had been waiting for. It was risky. Meeting a source alone, off the books, went against protocol. But the case was too sensitive, the potential for leaks too high. He made a decision, a fatal one. He would go. His last known communication was a phone call to Eleanor at 5:15 p.m. He told her he would be working late and not to wait up for dinner. She would later recall that he sounded distracted, his voice distant. She asked if everything was all right. "Just tying up a loose end," he said. "I love you." Those were the last words she would ever hear from him. Before leaving his office, he methodically locked his files away. He straightened his desk, a man of habit even under duress. On his keychain, among the standard keys for his house and car, was a small, peculiar brass key. It was for a personal safe deposit box, where he kept his will and other important family documents, a detail no one knew but Eleanor, a seemingly insignificant object that would one day become a painful reminder of a life meticulously planned and brutally interrupted. He walked out of the Hoover building just before 6 p.m., a man walking toward a meeting he believed would make his career. Instead, it was an appointment with oblivion. The city lights were beginning to flicker on as he drove away, accelerating steadily into the Washington twilight and into a mystery that would consume the next 7 years. Eleanor Glimmer looked at the clock on the bedside table. 1:17 a.m. A cold dread, sharp and unwelcome, began to creep into the edges of her consciousness. Frank working late was normal. Frank not calling to say he'd be this late was not. He was a man of precision and consideration. A simple phone call was part of his personal code. She had drifted off to sleep around 11:00 p.m., leaving the porch light on, but a primal sense of wrongness had pulled her from her dreams. She sat up in bed, the silence of the house suddenly feeling vast and threatening. She padded downstairs, her bare feet cold on the hardwood floor. The porch light was still on, casting a lonely yellow square onto the empty driveway. No black Ford sedan. She went to the phone in the kitchen, her hand hesitating over the receiver. Who would she even call at this hour? Calling the bureau seemed dramatic. She was the wife of an FBI agent. She knew not to panic. But panic was a vine, wrapping itself tightly around her heart. She made a cup of tea, her hands trembling slightly. She sat at the kitchen table, watching the minutes tick by. 2 a.m., 3 a.m. Each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded like a hammer blow. The sun began to rise on Wednesday morning, and with it came the certainty that something was terribly wrong. Her composure finally shattered. With tears streaming down her face, She dialed the number for Frank's superior, Deputy Director Evans. His voice on the other end was initially groggy, then sharp with professional concern. "Eleanor, what is it?" Her voice was a choked whisper. He never came home. The machine of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, slow to turn for personal matters, began to grind into motion. By mid-morning, the initial inquiry had yielded a deeply unsettling discovery. Frank Glimmer's Ford sedan had been located. It wasn't crashed on the side of a highway or abandoned on a city street. It was parked neatly in a long-term parking garage at Dulles International Airport. The parking stub on the dashboard was time-stamped 7:48 p.m. the previous evening. The car was locked. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken windows, no blood. It was almost pristine. Too pristine. A forensics team was dispatched immediately. They dusted the car for prints, combing every inch of the interior. The scene was eerily sterile, as if it had been wiped clean. There was only one thing out of place. On the rearview mirror, perfectly positioned, was a single slightly smudged fingerprint. It didn't match Frank. His briefcase, the leather satchel that was practically an extension of his arm and contained his active case files, was missing. His service weapon was not in the glove compartment where it was supposed to be. The initial theory formed quickly. Agent Glimmer had fled. The car at the airport, the missing briefcase, it pointed to a man who had intentionally run. But to those who knew him, it made no sense. Frank was not a man who ran from anything. As investigators swarmed the parking garage, the initial confusion and disbelief began to curdle into a palpable sense of panic. The discovery of the car didn't provide answers. It only deepened the enigma. It was a scene devoid of chaos but screaming with intent. An agent of the FBI had vanished, leaving behind only a silent car, a single mysterious fingerprint, and a gaping hole where a man used to be. The questions mounted with every passing hour. Did he leave on a secret assignment? Was he kidnapped? Or had the unthinkable happened? Had Frank Glimmer, the model agent, turned rogue and disappeared into the night? The disappearance of a federal agent triggered an immediate, high-priority investigation. But from the very beginning, the search for Frank Glimmer was hamstrung by a peculiar and suffocating set of circumstances. The full force of the FBI was theoretically mobilized, yet the effort felt disjointed and strangely constrained. The case file was immediately stamped with the highest level of classification, citing national security concerns. This single act created an impenetrable wall around the investigation. Seasoned agents found themselves denied access to critical information, their inquiries blocked by bureaucratic red tape that seemed intentionally obstructive. The official reason given was the sensitive nature of Glimmer's final case, but to many on the inside, it felt like a deliberate kneecapping of their own efforts. The frustration within the ranks began to fester. A team was assigned to trace Glimmer's last movements, starting with the mysterious meeting at the Starlight Motel. They found the registration for room 112 was under a common false name, paid for in cash. The room itself was clean. Housekeeping had tidied it up the morning after Frank's disappearance, erasing any potential evidence. The motel clerk remembered a man matching the description checking in, but couldn't offer any more detail. It was a dead end. The most promising lead was the informant Frank was supposed to meet. After days of digging through Glimmer's heavily redacted case notes, investigators identified him as a young congressional aide named Peter Hayes. But when they went to question him, they were too late. Hayes had been found dead in his apartment 2 days after Glimmer vanished. The official cause of death was ruled a heroin overdose. It seemed plausible. Hayes had a known history of drug use, but the timing was too perfect, too convenient. To the agents working the case, it screamed of a professional hit, a loose end being tied up. Yet, the official report stood, and another critical avenue of investigation was slammed shut. The single smudged fingerprint found on the rearview mirror of Frank's car was run through every database the FBI had. There was no match. It belonged to a ghost. As weeks turned into months, the official narrative, pushed aggressively from the top echelons of the Bureau, began to solidify. Deputy Director Evans, the man Frank had met with on his final day, held a press conference. He spoke in solemn tones about the tragedy of a good man losing his way. He floated the theory that Agent Glimmer, perhaps under immense pressure or tempted by dark forces, had become a double agent. The car at the airport was painted as evidence of an escape, a flight to a foreign country to sell national secrets. Frank Glimmer was no longer a missing hero. He was being rebranded as a traitor. This narrative was a dagger in the heart of Eleanor and her family. She knew Frank. She knew his character, his unwavering moral compass. The man being described in the newspapers was a stranger, a fiction created to neatly close an inconvenient case. She fought back, giving interviews, pleading with the media to see the truth, but her voice was drowned out by the official, authoritative machine of the government. The search methodologies themselves were flawed by this misdirection. Instead of focusing on a potential kidnapping or murder in the D.C. area, resources were wasted chasing phantom leads in Europe and South America. Agents were sent on wild goose chases, following up on bogus sightings of Glimmer in foreign capitals. The internal conflict was immense. The agents who had known and respected Frank felt they were being forced to participate in the character assassination of a colleague, while the true circumstances of his disappearance were being deliberately ignored. The investigation stalled, not for a lack of effort from the agents on the ground, but because of a powerful, unseen hand guiding it toward failure. The frustration curdled into a cold, hard certainty. Someone powerful wanted Frank Glimmer to stay gone, and they were using the full weight of the FBI to ensure it. The formal investigation wound down, not with a conclusion, but with a quiet, bureaucratic fizzle. The case of Special Agent Frank Glimmer was officially moved to the cold case files, a thick manila folder relegated to a dusty shelf in a cavernous records room. For the world, the story was over. For the Glimmer family, the nightmare was just beginning to settle in for the long haul. The passage of years did not heal the wound. It only allowed the pain to sink deeper into their bones. 7 years is a lifetime. For Sarah and Michael, it was the chasm that separated a faint, dreamlike memory of a father from the harsh reality of his absence. They grew up in a house where a ghost lived in every room. Frank's study remained untouched, a perfect time capsule from 1971. His books sat on the shelves. His reading glasses lay on the desk next to a stack of papers, a faint scent of his pipe tobacco still clinging to the curtains. Eleanor couldn't bring herself to change it. It was both a shrine and a torment, a daily reminder of the man who had been the center of their world. The official narrative that Frank was a traitor had poisoned their lives. The whispers followed them at the grocery store. Old friends stopped calling, their unease and suspicion creating an unbridgeable distance. The Glimmer name, once a source of pride, was now tainted with shame. Sarah, once a bright and outgoing child, became withdrawn and quiet at school. Michael, too young to have clear memories, constructed a father from the warring stories he heard, the hero his mother described, and the villain the world whispered about. He was a boy fighting shadows, defending a man he barely knew. Eleanor's fight never ended. She wrote letters to the FBI director, to congressmen, to journalists, pleading for them to reopen the case, to clear Frank's name. Most went unanswered. The few replies she received were formal, polite dismissals. She was seen as a grieving wife in denial, unable to accept the terrible truth about her husband. Her strength was immense, but the weight of fighting a faceless, powerful institution alone was crushing. The emotional toll was a slow erosion of spirit. Hope, once a burning fire, dwindled to a faint, flickering ember, shielded against a merciless wind. Within the FBI, the story of Frank Glimmer morphed into a piece of grim folklore. For new agents, he was a cautionary tale, a ghost story told at Quantico to illustrate the pressures that could break a man. He became a symbol of failure, a dark chapter in the Bureau's history that was best left unexamined. The mystery of his disappearance became a grim landmark in the collective memory of the agency, a permanent question mark. The 7 years that passed were not empty. They were filled with birthdays without a father, holidays with an empty chair at the table, and the constant, gnawing ache of uncertainty. The world had moved on, but the Glimmer family remained trapped in October of 1971, waiting for an answer that, it seemed, would never come. Hopelessness had become the new normal. In the summer of 1978, 7 years after Frank Glimmer vanished, a demolition notice was posted on the boarded-up entrance of the old Regent Arms apartment building in Arlington, Virginia. The building was a relic, a rundown structure that had been slowly decaying for years, its few remaining tenants long gone. Before the wrecking ball could swing, a small, independent clean-out crew was hired to salvage any remaining contents and clear the units. The work was dusty, monotonous, and grim. On the third floor, at the end of a dimly lit hallway, they came to apartment 3B. Unlike the other units, which were either unlocked or had simple, flimsy locks, this door was secured with a heavy-duty industrial padlock. It was rusted but solid. The foreman of the crew, a man named Dave Heston, was a retired police officer. His old cop instincts, dormant for years, suddenly flared to life. A padlock on an apartment door wasn't unusual, but this one was different. It was on the outside. Someone had locked this room from the hallway, sealing it shut. It wasn't meant to keep intruders out. It was meant to keep something, or someone, in. Heston's curiosity turned into a gut feeling he couldn't shake. He told his crew to hold off on this unit. He went to the building manager's office, a dusty room in the basement, and sifted through a box of old, disorganized rental records. He eventually found the ledger for 1971. The entry for apartment 3B was bizarre. It had been rented in September of that year under the name John Smith. The tenant had paid for 10 years of rent up front, in cash. There was no forwarding address, no contact information, nothing. And according to the building's patchy records, no one had been seen entering or leaving that apartment for years. This was more than just a simple abandoned unit. This was a secret, sealed, and paid for. Heston's gut feeling solidified into professional suspicion. A professional padlock on the outside, a decade of rent paid in cash, a false name. It all added up to something that needed a closer look. It was a small detail, a coincidence born from a demolition schedule, and the intuition of a retired cop. He could have ignored it. His crew could have simply snapped the lock with bolt cutters, cleared the room, and moved on. The secret of apartment 3B would have been hauled away to a landfill, buried forever under tons of debris. But Dave Heston made a different choice. He walked back out to his truck, picked up his radio, and called the Arlington Police Department. He reported a suspicious, sealed residence. He didn't know it, but with that single, unremarkable phone call, he had just stumbled upon the key. He had found the loose thread that, once pulled, would unravel a 7-year-old mystery and expose a truth far darker and more complex than anyone had ever imagined. The cold case of Frank Glimmer was about to be reignited, not by a brilliant detective, but by the coincidental discovery of a locked door. The call from Dave Heston was initially treated as a low-priority welfare check. 2 uniformed Arlington police officers arrived at the Regent Arms, their expressions bored. But when Heston showed them the heavy padlock on the outside of the door and explained the bizarre rental history, their interest sharpened. Standard procedure wasn't going to work here. They called in a supervisor, who, after assessing the scene, made the decision to get a warrant and have forensics on standby. Something about the sealed room felt profoundly wrong. Hours later, with the warrant in hand, an officer snapped the rusted padlock with a pair of heavy bolt cutters. The sound echoed in the silent, derelict hallway. He pushed the door open. The air that billowed out was stale and musty, the smell of time locked away. The apartment was a perfect time capsule. It was sparsely furnished, a single bed with a thin mattress, a small wooden table, and 1 straight-back chair. A thick layer of dust covered everything, undisturbed for years. It looked like a Spartan hideout, a transient's room. But on the center of the table sat a black leather briefcase. An officer, wearing gloves, carefully opened the latches. The contents were stunning. On top was a wallet containing the FBI credentials and badge of Special Agent Frank Glimmer. Beneath it were thick files filled with surveillance photos, financial statements, and handwritten notes. And at the bottom of the briefcase were 3 small cassette tapes. The discovery of Glimmer's credentials instantly transformed the scene from a local police matter into a major federal crime scene. The FBI was notified immediately. Within an hour, the decrepit apartment building was swarming with agents, a new generation who had only known the Glimmer case as a cold file, a piece of bureau legend. The forensics team began a meticulous sweep of the room. The question was no longer what happened to Frank Glimmer, but where was he? The apartment was a prison, but it held no body. Then, a sharp-eyed young agent in the forensics unit noticed something odd about the closet. The floorboards inside were made of a slightly different wood. their finish newer than the scratched, worn flooring in the rest of the apartment. They didn't sit quite flush. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible difference. He called over his team leader. Using a crowbar, they carefully pried up the first board. The wood groaned in protest. Underneath was not the subfloor they expected, but a dark, hollow space, a hidden compartment. A wave of sickeningly sweet, cloying odor, the unmistakable smell of advanced decomposition, rose from the darkness. A powerful flashlight cut through the gloom, its beam falling upon a human skeleton, wrapped in a heavy canvas tarp. The 7-year search for Frank Glimmer was over. The investigation kicked into a ferocious, high-octane gear. While the medical examiner worked to officially identify the remains through dental records, a process that would quickly confirm the body was Glimmer's, a team of analysts was dispatched to the FBI's audio lab with the 3 cassette tapes. They worked through the night cleaning up the hiss and crackle of the old recordings. What they heard was explosive. The first tape was a recording of a meeting. The voices were clear. One was Frank Glimmer's. The other 2, after being run through voice print analysis, were identified with chilling certainty. One belonged to a powerful congressman Glimmer had been investigating. The other belonged to Deputy Director Evans, the very man who had overseen the failed search and publicly labeled Glimmer a traitor. The tape captured the moment of the trap. Glimmer had arrived at the apartment expecting to meet his informant. Instead, Evans and the congressman were waiting. They tried to blackmail him, to force him to drop the investigation. The tape recorded Frank's unwavering refusal. "The evidence is the evidence," his voice, calm and resolute, said on the tape. "I'm not burying it. I'm taking it to the director." Then the sound of a struggle, a chair being knocked over, a muffled cry. The tape went silent. The other tapes contained conversations between Evans and the congressman after the murder, meticulously planning the cover-up. They discussed planting the car at the airport, creating the traitor narrative, and silencing the informant, Peter Hayes. They had orchestrated every detail of the failed investigation from the inside. The final, critical piece of the puzzle snapped into place. The smudged fingerprint from the rearview mirror of Glimmer's car, preserved in the case file for 7 years, was rerun against the known prints of Deputy Director Evans. It was a perfect match. They had it all. The motive, the means, the confession on tape, and the forensic link. The ghost story had a final chapter, and it was a tale of cold-blooded murder and a conspiracy of power. Warrants were issued. At dawn, 2 teams of FBI agents, acting with a grim sense of purpose, moved out. One team descended on the quiet, luxurious retirement home of now former Deputy Director Evans. The other drove to the stately D.C. residence of the still powerful congressman. The trap that was set for Frank Glimmer 7 years earlier had finally closed on his killers. The arrests of a sitting congressman and a decorated former deputy director of the FBI sent a seismic shockwave through Washington, D.C. and the nation. The story exploded across every news channel and newspaper. The carefully constructed narrative of Frank Glimmer, the rogue agent, was shattered overnight, replaced by the horrific, stunning truth. He was a hero who had been murdered to protect a criminal conspiracy. The why behind the 7-year mystery was now laid bare for all to see, pieced together from the contents of the briefcase and the chilling confessions on the audio tapes. Frank Glimmer had stumbled upon a sprawling and audacious blackmail operation. The congressman, using his position on a powerful oversight committee, had been working with Deputy Director Evans to conduct illegal surveillance on dozens of his political rivals and colleagues. They had amassed a trove of compromising information, financial indiscretions, extramarital affairs, hidden addictions, and were using it to manipulate legislation, kill investigations, and consolidate their own power. They had a stranglehold on the nation's capital, built on secrets and fear. Glimmer, in his typically methodical fashion, had been investigating a seemingly minor leak from the congressman's office. But Frank's refusal to quit pulling on a thread meant he unraveled the entire tapestry. He followed the evidence relentlessly, and it led him directly to the heart of the conspiracy. He discovered the illegal wiretaps, the secret bank accounts, and the role Evans played in using the Bureau's resources to facilitate the scheme. Evans and the congressman knew Glimmer's character. He was incorruptible. He couldn't be bought, bribed, or intimidated. When they realized he had uncovered the full extent of their operation, They knew he would not stop until he had exposed them. He was a threat that had to be neutralized. The plan they devised was cold and calculated. They used Glimmer's own informant, Peter Hayes, as bait, forcing him to set the trap at the Starlight Motel before changing the location to the secure, prepaid apartment. When Frank arrived, they confronted him one last time. The tape recording of that confrontation became the prosecution's centerpiece. It was a testament to Frank's courage. He refused their demands, sealing his fate. They murdered him right there in the apartment, wrapped his body, and concealed it beneath the floorboards. To silence the last witness, they had Peter Hayes killed, staging his death to look like a drug overdose. The final, most cynical part of their plan was the cover-up. Evans, using his authority as deputy director, personally directed the investigation into Glimmer's disappearance. He planted the car at the airport to create the illusion of flight. He classified the case file to prevent honest agents from getting too close to the truth. He systematically dismantled the search, sending his own agents on pointless errands, while he publicly and methodically destroyed the reputation of the man he had murdered. For 7 years, they had relied on the sealed room and the power of their lie to keep them safe. The entire sordid chain of events was laid out in a series of press conferences and court filings. The hero's name was cleared in the most dramatic fashion possible, while the villains, once untouchable figures of authority, were exposed as common murderers. Frank Glimmer had been silenced, but in the end, the truth he died for had a voice of its own. The news was delivered to the Glimmer family by the new director of the FBI in person. He came to their home, not with speculation or condolences, but with the truth. He sat in their living room, the same room where they had spent 2,155 days waiting, and told Eleanor, Sarah, and Michael what had happened to their husband and father. He told them Frank had not been a traitor, but a hero of the highest order. He explained the conspiracy, the murder, and the arrests. For Eleanor, the moment was a cataclysm of emotion. There was a profound, earth-shattering wave of validation. The truth she had held onto like a lonely flag in a hurricane was now the official record. Her Frank, the man she knew, was restored to her. But this vindication was inseparable from the horrifying confirmation of his violent death and the crushing weight of 7 years of injustice. The relief was drenched in grief. The what-ifs were agonizing. What if someone had listened to her sooner? What if the Bureau hadn't abandoned him? The years they had lost, the childhood moments Michael and Sarah had spent without their father, the shadow of shame they had lived under. None of it could be given back. Sarah, now 13, wept silently, mourning not just the father she barely remembered, but the hero she had just discovered. Michael, now 11, listened with a fierce intensity. The confusing, abstract figure of his father finally came into sharp, heroic focus. The shame he had felt about his name was instantly replaced by an overwhelming sense of pride. His father hadn't left them. He had been taken from them while fighting for what was right. A few days later, in a formal ceremony at the Hoover Building, the director publicly apologized to the Glimmer family on behalf of the entire institution. He presented Eleanor with a folded American flag and Frank's badge, now polished and gleaming. It was a moment of profound public and private closure. For the world, it was the final act of a dramatic story. For the family, it was the first day of a new kind of grief, a grief that was no longer complicated by doubt or shame, but was now pure, a clean and honest mourning for the man they loved and lost. They had the truth, and it was both a comfort and a cross to bear. The relief was real, but it could never outweigh the pain of the years wasted under the weight of a devastating lie. They could finally begin to heal, but the scars of those 7 years would remain forever. The Frank Glimmer case became more than just a solved mystery. It became a catalyst for profound change. His murder, orchestrated from within the very institution he had sworn to serve, exposed a terrifying vulnerability at the heart of American law enforcement. The public and Congress were horrified that such a deep-seated corruption could not only exist, but could also successfully manipulate a federal investigation to conceal a murder for 7 years. In the wake of the scandal, Congress launched a series of hearings that resulted in the passage of new legislation aimed at strengthening internal oversight within the FBI and other intelligence agencies. These laws established more robust whistleblower protections, and created independent review boards to investigate allegations of high-level misconduct, ensuring that no single official could ever again have the power to bury a case or control a narrative with such impunity. At the FBI Academy in Quantico, the Glimmer case was integrated into the training curriculum. It is still taught today as a seminal case study, not in forensics or investigative technique, but in ethics and institutional integrity. It serves as a stark reminder to every new agent of the dangers of unchecked power and the absolute necessity of holding true to the principles of justice, even when, especially when, the pressure to do otherwise comes from within. The legacy of Frank Glimmer was, therefore, twofold. Personally, his name was not only cleared, but elevated. He was posthumously awarded the FBI Medal of Valor. His story was no longer a cautionary tale about a fallen agent, but an inspiring saga of a man who made the ultimate sacrifice for his convictions. For his children, he became a permanent symbol of courage. On a broader institutional level, his death forced a painful but necessary self-examination. The tragedy led to reforms that made the Bureau stronger, more transparent, and more accountable. In this way, Frank's final silent act of defiance, his refusal to compromise his integrity in that dusty Arlington apartment, had an impact far greater than any single case he could have prosecuted. His devotion to the truth, the very quality that led to his murder, ultimately served to protect the institution he loved, leaving behind a legacy of honor that outshone the darkness of his own demise. One man's unwavering refusal to compromise became a 7-year mystery, a case solved only by a twist of fate that revealed a truth more corrupt and sinister than anyone had dared to imagine. His story is a powerful testament to the fact that while lies may have power for a time, the truth, however deeply buried, will eventually find its way to the light. If this case struck you, and you believe in the importance of uncovering the truth, please help our community grow by liking this video, sharing it with others, and subscribing for more true crime mysteries and unsolved cases. And tell us in the comments, what do you believe is the most shocking part of this conspiracy?